Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. Everyone, great Wednesday. My name is King. I'm here with my co-host Reggie. So, how you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing well, King. Always, great to see you on our Wednesday mornings. So, I absolutely cannot complain.
Well, how's the weather there?
Beautiful. If you like northeastern autumns, bright blue sky, a lot of color in the foliage, and although this morning it was 34 degrees here, I'm in the middle of Connecticut, and with 34 degrees, the high will be in the 50s. But it's I love sweatshirt weather in the fall, so for me it's beautiful.
Well, I've come to appreciate it myself. It's about 40 degrees here in Baltimore.
Yeah.
So, I know my dog, a pit bull, she's not enjoying it as much outside. I know that she's being a little more conservative, trying to conserve heat. And so I
Yeah.
got to keep her active, but she's just sitting still. She doesn't enjoy it as much. So I'm learning her temperature gauge, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's get ready to get started. We are shifting to a new topic today, and before we get into today's discussion, we go with our normal, I would say, format of saying what we're grateful for, our gratitude moment. You want to go first, Reggie?
Sure, I'll jump in. Thanks, King. And again, I'll repeat my typical statement is I'm really grateful for indoor plumbing and a refrigerator that has food that I chose and I can get pretty easily. And I know that I'm better off than probably 95 to 98% of people on the planet just having those two things. And this morning I was reminded of how great, of some things, because the electricity in the house went off for about 4 seconds. Everything blinked and then came back on. And I wouldn't be talking I wouldn't be talking to you right now if it had stayed off.
Mm.
So I'm just grateful for some of the infrastructure that we kind of take for granted nowadays in a in a fairly well structured society. And then beyond that, just to be talking to you in good health with uh, I can speak in mostly complete sentences and organize my thoughts still. So I'm grateful for all of that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing. And, I'm grateful for my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have sound mind. Grateful for another 24 hours to pursue my purpose in life, uh, my meaning in life, as well as I'm grateful for my mother to still be alive and my brother allowing or pushing initiative to, give her flowers while she's still alive. And so we're planning to spend, every weekend with her, the family together. So that's something that she enjoys, and I'm glad to be a part of seeing that, experiencing that. And I'm grateful for the infinite possibilities that today is going to bring. And I'm also grateful for the challenges and the problems I'm having in my life.
Hmm.
Working through resolving some issues, and I'm grateful for those problems because I realize that through the solution of these problems, not only would it be solving my personal problems, but I would be creating a blueprint for change and creating new systems that will have an ongoing positive impact for generations going forward. So I've learned to be appreciative of problems and the faith and the wisdom to focus on the solution and not focus on being a victim for it. So I'm grateful for having that mentality and that kind of clarity. So with that being said, you about to say something, Reggie?
Yeah, two things that you just said, I just wanted to comment on really quickly. I love what you said about your mom and spending, feeling blessed that she's still alive and committing to spending, parts of weekends with her. Because one of my fondest memories, I took care of my mom for the last 3.5 years of her life, 96
Mm.
through 99. And some of the best moments where we didn't eat dinner every night together, but we typically did. And we would sit at her table and she could look out the back door from the kitchen, and we had bird feeders hanging there. So we'd have dessert and a cup of tea, and she'd be looking out there, and we just love seeing the birds go to the feeders, like little moments like that I'm really grateful I got to share with her as an adult. And then the second thing you said about problems and challenges, and really being grateful for them is one of the things I'm in mid right now. And you know this because we're, what we're doing right now as part of it is I love to write, I love to teach, and marketing. Like no one should take marketing advice from it. So for me to market the book and get attention for it, and I'm in touch with independent bookstores and libraries and just doing that every day. There's moments when it's really discouraging because independent bookstores and libraries have access to thousands and thousands of books and new things coming their way. So to get attention for what it is that I'm trying to promote with this new book, sometimes it can be really discouraging. I won't give up because I tend not to, but that idea of being grateful for the challenge and how important is it for me to get word of this book out, this Healing America's project out into the world. So you just reminded me of that with your gratitude for challenges and problems. So thank you. And thank you for having these conversations, because this is one of the ways that we get the word out. So I'm really, as always, I'm grateful to you and for you for that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've learned to really appreciate, you know, problems and challenges, because that's the only time we really appreciate when we accomplish something. If it was easy, like getting out of bed is for the most part taken for granted. No one says, "Well, I got out of bed. I really worked hard getting out of bed today." And somebody says, "Great job," because that's a given that you got out of bed. But
Yeah,
when you begin to have challenges, and our minds are natural problem solvers anyway. That's how we function. That's how we think. And I've often learned that it's through the course of when you're worried, you only worried because you can't solve your problem. And the best way to overcome worry is to solve someone else's problem, because it puts you right back in your natural problem solving state, and it gets your
right.
mind off you, right?
Yeah,
And so that's what I've learned, that when you shift your thinking to just being grateful for everything, you see the world in a whole different perspective. And
yeah,
as you say, you appreciate the birds feeding out off the bird feeder.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like you have to get older to realize that, because just real quickly before we get into our discussion, you know I have two dogs now, and they're both puppies, both under a year. And how it's the same thing as a child. When you're growing up, you're just enjoying the energy of being alive. You don't really care about your environment so much. It's just you're happy to just be present and just be out and just be active. And then when you get to be older, then you realize, wow, there's colors out here. There's beautiful flowers that's been growing here for years. There's a nice breeze that's here, and I can feel it on my face. And the sun comes up and it's beautiful at 5 a.m. in the morning when the sun rises. You don't take and count those things when you're younger, but when you get older, you definitely learn to appreciate those and begin to build with those. So, with that, why don't you go ahead and set the context for our discussion for
yeah.
today?
Yeah, thanks, King. So again, we're talking about healing America's narratives. Is the title of the book. The subtitle is "The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow." And then there's a little tag underneath there that says "Becoming More Fully Human." And what we're talking about today is what really gets built up in chapter 2 of the book, which is that piece of what we mean by the shadow. And in the book, and again, we're focusing on the shadow is those parts of ourselves that we don't know we're there. It's things that and if we do know, we deny it. We make believe we don't know. But by definition, shadow is what's repressed or hidden. Um, and for the context of this book, I identified 9 elements of shadow. I wish it had been fewer, but as I did more research through the various chapters of American history and current events, I mean, all 9 of them kept showing up. So I'll just name them, and then we can begin to tease apart, historical and/or current iterations of them across various themes and issues. So they are in no particular order. Actually, let me rephrase that, because I believe that often this is the order in which they manifest. So it begins with ignorance, not knowing, and ignorance is not an insult. It means just I don't know something. Right. So
Right.
ignorance, arrogance is the second one. fear, bigotry, bullying, violence, greed, excess, and untrust. A quick overview, very often easy, I believe, to see historically. Um, Present in current events as well, but a lot of people would disagree with some of the characterizations. But when, you know, early European explorers, colonizers showed up on their way to, they thought they were going to India, and ended up bumping into these huge two continents, the Americas. They were ignorant of the peoples they bumped into, both in Africa and their ignorance of who they met led them to feel arrogant or superior. And a lot of that came from the orders given to them by the various religions, the Anglican Church in Great Britain and the Catholic Church in Portugal and Spain. And in that arrogance, they felt they were superior to the Africans they encountered and the indigenous peoples in the Americas, with some fear involved. And they just, developed into what I would call a bigoted perspective, where, we're right and they're wrong. Um, Bullied them, horrible violence toward, both Africans and indigenous peoples here. And then once they began to settle into the Americas, including when it became the United States of America, much of what went on perpetuated that ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, and violence, but it was also marked by greed, excess, and untrustworthiness. And so that's in a nutshell of, if we look carefully at American history, all of those are present. And I think it's important to remind myself that that's what it's not saying that's all that's true about the United States. The book is zeroing in on the collective shadow of the country, that part that we either don't know is there, many of us, or that we want to make believe isn't there. And until we recognize it collectively, own it, okay, this is true, and then begin to integrate it, we won't be fully human beings, and we will continue, I believe, to exist in this polarized world right now, where political differences get people calling each other un-American. Where now, if you disagree with somebody, you point your finger and say, that's un-American, as opposed to, oh, we have a difference of opinion. Let's see if we can get on the same page. So it's, in a nutshell, I mean, that's the core of this shadow that we're talking about. So I'll put a period there and see what's coming up for you.
Well, as I read your book around the shadow, and you talk about the collective shadow, and then you just gave the reference to how politically, depending on what party, we're so polarized now that that's actually an insult. People feel offended when you choose one party or the other. If you're around a lot of right-wing Republicans and you say you're a liberal, then they're going to be offended. And the same thing if you're a liberal and you're around and you say that you're a right-wing Republican, then they've been offended. I've been in environments where it's been in my different meetings, and it's definitely, in Maryland, we're definitely predominantly a Democratic city, a blue state, even though we've had a Republican governor for the last 8 years. The 4 or 5 people that stood up and said they were Trump supporters, Republicans, they were pretty much attacked. Like, how dare you? Like, you must be out of your mind to be a Trump Republican. This is back when Trump first was elected, so not so much. Now I don't know how many of those people will still double down on Trump and support him, consistent where he's at now, because it seems to be that, from what I'm saying, and I'll get back to the point about the collective shadow, but it just seems from a political context that what Trump's truest diehard supporters are folks who feel they're victims of something. And I was watching Bill Maher the other day, and he brought some good points in the context that it's so much what I think was drawing people to that thought, that collective shadow around what he's been able to build, is just how I would say the liberal left is willing to make changes. When they're saying, well, this cancel culture, which you talk about in your book, how that's accepted now, that we can cancel someone because of different ideologies or different beliefs or something they've said in the past, and they can come back to the future now. I mean, come present, and we deal with them now in the present, where it's like folks could not have changed based off what the collective thought it might have been at that particular time. So I say all that because if you study history like you have in your book, well, I wasn't alive, but from when I read around the time of McCarthyism, that's to me seems very similar to the kind of energy and the kind of vitriol and the way people will be attacking by calling someone, you say un-American now is, I mean, back then it was more you're a communist, which still was un-American in that context.
Yeah.
And if people were put in that group, then they were taken before, Congress and subcommittees, and, a lot of actors and writers and people like that were pretty much discarded throughout history, or ostracized, or even incarcerated because of that. So now the question begins to see how far down this polarization we would go this time. Like, we don't even learn from history. Like I said before in our last discussion, Donald Trump was willing to say, lock Hillary up. Again, reminiscent of that time of locking someone up because you believe that their political ideology is so different from yours that they deserve to be in jail for theirs, as though you're so right in yours. And that's where people say that the left is gone. They've gone to be so judgmental to say, we're right about everything and you're wrong and you're a monster. And so the right's way of coming back at that is, you're not American and I got to attack you. So I don't know if I really answered any questions there, but other than probably brought in more things to discuss, because that's just deal with the politics of it right now for the moment. The collective shadow, how would you say a person can feel that they're slipping into that collective shadow as opposed to dealing with their own individual shadow? And in other words, does a person need to deal with their own individual shadow first before they get drawn into this collective shadow? Is that what the attraction is? Because you haven't dealt with that, it's easier to get pulled into this collective shadow?
Yeah. So great question. And so, yes, I mean, if we as individuals explore and work with our own individual shadows, and everybody has it, and it has no shadow, has no politics. If you're human, there's parts of yourself that you were forced that your family of origin and your earliest cultural givens said not, you really shouldn't have that, and so it gets pushed aside. Robert Bly basically said that we spend our first X number of years filling up this long invisible bag behind us with parts of ourselves that we're not supposed to have. And then from about the age of 20 to the end of our life, if we're paying attention, we work hard trying to empty the bag and reintegrate with all that stuff. So that was a great image of it. Yeah. So the collective shadow only exists based on enough people having similar individual shadows. So the nation, the United States of America, or any nation, doesn't have an individual psyche or an ego like a person does. So when we speak about collective shadow, we're speaking about the cumulative impact of millions of people. Not every American, there are different aspects of shadow. Democrats have some, Republicans have some, conservatives, liberals. The really important piece is that both sides, if we just stay with politics for a moment, both sides do exactly the same things. They wag their fingers at each other and they accuse each other of whatever they want to accuse each other of. Now, their content, their belief systems are different in terms of what they want for the country, in terms of tax, economy, and equal rights and all of that. But they use the same tactics and strategies against each other. And that's part of the shadow, when they just wag their fingers, but they're doing exactly the same thing to each other. The very thing that Republicans accuse Democrats of doing and Democrats accuse Republicans of doing, they're basically just projecting what they do onto the other. And I would say accurately, because they both do the same thing. So I like that you brought up the cancel piece because in fact, McCarthyism, which was a movement on the right, attempted to cancel people who had more views on the left. And most of them were artists and entertainers and some politicians as well. And now it's flipped the other way. If people on the left don't like what somebody who doesn't agree with them 100% have to say, they try to cancel them. And it's the only difference is McCarthy did it in the courts with congressional hearings. The left nowadays does it with social media and some mainstream media as well. So the medium has shifted, but the actual act kind of remains the same. And I argue in the book that feeling woke and canceling others or attempting to cancel those who you feel are not as woke as you are, that language is new, but it's been done in this country since the inception of the country. I mean, two really simple examples, which some people might disagree with, but I'm open to conversation. And it's the examples I mentioned at the top of the conversation. The British colonists, the explorers who came to the country, again, they didn't have language, but in their British culture, when they discovered African cultures, right, who were very different from theirs, the Brits decided that not only were the African cultures different, they felt that they were inferior and they should be enslaved. So another way to say that is the British felt more woke than the Africans and effectively, literally tried to cancel their culture, literally put them on ships. Many of them died coming across the Atlantic Ocean, and then they got here, they were enslaved. Example number two, and there are many of these. And I feel like I'm stating the obvious, but I think it's important to put this in historical perspective. Basically, the same thing happened with the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the Iroquois and the Aztec. That's South America. I'm trying to stay in North America for now. But the Lakota Sioux, the Seminole, the Creek, all of the different Native American nations, they were viewed as inferior cultures. The British and then the Americans felt superior to them, more woke than them, and in a different way than they treated the Africans, but with a very similar result. They basically took their land as opposed to taking them from their land, lied to them, broke every treaty they made, and when they couldn't use any other means, they slaughtered them. And the Native Americans fought back. But it's, again, those are two historical examples of people who perceived themselves because of their own ignorance and arrogance. In this case, it was the British and then the Americans, Brits who became Americans. They felt superior, they felt more woke, and so they tried to cancel African and Native American cultures. That happened in Vietnam. We felt like we were more democratically woke than the people of Vietnam. We went over there and failed miserably at trying to cancel their culture and make them more like us. There are many, many examples of that. We just have the latest iteration of it now on social media and mainstream media, but it's absolutely not new historically. So,
something I want to address there, and what you said, and you talk about it in your book. You talk about cultural givens, and this is an example of a cultural given. Like, for example, you write that the behavior of wokeness has always been there as far as how people dealt with it. But what's interesting is that I would say the slang term woke came out of, to my knowledge and growing up, out of the Black community. And it wasn't used in that kind of terminology that it's used. It was kind of co-opted by the liberal left with a different meaning. They just took it and co-opted it. In other words, woke, when we said it, was more of a play on the word of you're asleep, meaning that you don't see what's happening before you. You're walking around and you're not conscious of being aware of the news, being aware of the world history, being aware of the environment. So you're asleep, you're not woke. So somebody would say, well, You need to wake up and experience life and see what's really in front of you.
Yep.
And so it wasn't meant to be said in the context of if you're not woke that you're need to be ostracized and victimized or called out on any kind of negative treatment towards you. It's just that it's just a matter of you're sleeping on your culture, you're sleeping on your community, you're sleeping on your society, you're sleeping on being a bad parent, and you need to wake up to that responsibility, so that accountability, so to speak. And so then it was co-opted by the left liberal media as a way of saying, well, I'm woke because now I'm much more um, empathetic to the sufferings of others. And so now they've taken their word woke and made it a negative thing. And then
Yeah.
the right came along and really branded it as a way of saying,
Yep.
well, now you're giving us ammunition to use to just really attack you. And that's what I would say the right is really great at doing, is really making their messaging very simple for their base.
Yep.
They come up with a very streamlined way of saying, okay, this person's woke, or they're saying woke, we're against woke, we're going to build a wall, you know, you're anti-American, so people can just really rally around it. It's not very difficult. Folks can really grasp it. And like, discussing critical race theory
Yeah.
and really letting that go down to the point where now people have now choose that term and they fight on the whole. And what I argue is, at the end of the day, it's just really history. You're teaching your kids history, but to get caught up giving it a title of critical race theory and making it seem like it's a different form of history now makes people opposed to it, as opposed to just make sure we teach the correct history, like the history that the people's history of the United States by Howard Zinn.
Zen. Yeah. Yeah.
You can't argue that. That's facts. You can't say, well, his book is all trash, we shouldn't teach that. His book is accurately in its factual base. That's not to do anything by being critical race theory. You know, so I'm just saying all this to say is that, so when you're saying woke in that context, that's what keeps flashing in my mind, because I had a different definition and in a different way we looked at woke in my community. And that was
Yeah.
something I had to learn when people start, like, there's a show on Hulu called Woke, and it's like millennials. So I think it's a part of being the millennial culture, not really understanding where it comes from. It's like, term like fresh and cool and bad, and bad back in the day used to be bad was good. Bad didn't really
Yeah.
mean
Yeah.
bad. So I think those are cultural givens that we got to overcome. And that's why I think a lot of Black folks now are offended, to be honest, when the discussions I had with people with how woke has been, again, pretty much co-opted, taken over, and then used as something to attack, you
Yeah.
know, or even something to rally around on the left. Like, like I remember I was a little offended by it, but not as greatly offended when about 2 years ago when group of Hollywood actors and actresses came out and they made these statements about how they felt guilty for what had happened here in America, because now they're realizing the racial atrocities and things. So they wanted to make these statements. And so, of course, they were ridiculed on both sides, left and right, for saying that. And my feeling's always been this: it's not so much of trying to make people feel guilty for what has happened in the past. It really comes down to a question of, as I talked about before, systems. Are you willing to change the system? And I mean, not change, but create new systems
Yeah.
and not function within the existing system? Because I don't care about your guilt if you still want to function within the existing system. If you say, well, there's no reason to change the system, I just feel a little guilty what happened. I just want to express my concern. And I want to make you feel that I understand where you're coming from. You don't if you still want me to live within this existing system.
Yeah.
So now, how about we put the energy towards changing, create a new system, and then we don't have to worry about you feeling guilty, because feeling guilt doesn't bring any kind of positive energy at all. At the end of the day, just real quick on my point, when it comes to, the more I learn about training and raising a dog, you have different sides to that discussion. Most people will argue that positive reinforcement is the only way to train a dog. Like, you never do anything negative to a dog at all. Either you're kind, give them treats and give them love, And then when a dog does something that you don't like or something that's they shouldn't do, then you don't give them love. But there's no, you don't hit them, you don't do anything negative, you don't shout at them. It's all positiveness. And now I believe that that's how we should treat humans as well. We should look at ways to be positive with the way we deal with people and don't judge a person, but judge the behavior. Because if you judge the behavior, now you can talk about the behaviors as it relates to the collective shadow, which I believe is a part of the system. And then we can really talk about that without people being offended. But if I talk about you as a person and you just exhibiting these behaviors, but I criticize you, then you're going to not listen to anything I have to say. You're going to just immediately feel that you've been attacked. And your natural inclination is to attack back.
Yeah. So without there's a lot in there. I love that. I want to, if it's okay, I want to go back to how you began with the different takes on the word woke. And I know you're familiar with this. And what I address in the book is I speak about being woke should not be a negative thing, but there are people, many people, who wield wokeness as a weapon. I'm woke, you're not. I'm superior, you're inferior. That's the move that's really dangerous. And in the history of being awake, so the earliest version of that I could find was the Buddha. Because he was, Buddha means the awakened one. Are you a saint? Are you a god? No. What are you? I'm awake. That's 2,500 years ago.
Right.
Fast forward to the 1860s in this country, and part of one of the groups of people that supported Abraham Lincoln and were abolitionists, they referred to themselves as the wide awakes. So that's another example. Again, not the word woke per se, but it means the same thing. And then the first, and I'm not saying this is the first one in existence, it's the first one I can speak about. So in Leadbelly's song, The Scottsboro Boys, at the very end of it, he does he kind of talks through the end of the song, and I can't quote it, but he basically says, if you go to Scottsboro, make sure you're woke, meaning be aware of what's going on, or else you could get seriously hurt. So stay awake to what's really true and happening, down there, because of what happened to the men in his song. The whole wielding one's wokeness as a weapon, and then the brilliant flipping of that to tie the idea of being woke in with critical race theory, a big part of which is intersectionality. Prior to 2020, virtually nobody in mainstream America ever heard of critical race theory.
Right.
They hadn't. And there was a guy up in Seattle who was a right-leaning journalist, and he wrote a piece on homelessness in Seattle, and it was kind of saying, kind of criticizing the homeless activists who were trying to help the homeless, and basically saying in his research, a lot of the people who were homeless, it was their own fault. So a lot of the people on the left didn't like that. So they plastered this guy's photograph, his home address, and pictures of his family all over telephone poles in his neighborhood, and began to criticize him, in our language now, to try to cancel him, which is horrible behavior. Again, as you said, it's going from disagreeing on an issue, in this case, homelessness, and what to do about it, to attacking a person who you disagree with. Unfortunately for them, this guy's name was Christopher Rufo. He fought back. And what he basically did was people began sending him information about others who had been attacked. And he heard about critical race theory, and he heard about Ibram Kendi, and he heard about Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility book.
Yes.
And he found that a lot of the people who were attacking him were fans of them. And he began the process of weaponizing critical race theory. I mean, you can read about what he did exactly. He ended up on the Tucker Carlson show. Mm-hmm. And within a month of being on that show, he was in the White House talking. Mark Meadows invited him there. So they completely took the bad behavior on the left, attacking him because they disagreed with him, and they flipped it over and they spoke about it. They just basically said, we're going to weaponize critical race theory. It's the left's own language. And they're immensely successful at it. There's not a school board in the nation that's not navigating critical race theory in some way. And the last thing I'll say is virtually none of the people who are advocating for critical race theory in schools, and I would say often unskillfully, trying to change the curriculum. There are many doing it skillfully as well, but many are not doing it skillfully. None of them are critical race theorists. They're people who read some stuff, believed it, and became activists and crusaders for what they believed in. But the critical race theorists are a combination of scholars, legal scholars, academic scholars, who since the 70s and well into the 80s were looking at the sudden stalling of the progress that was made after the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the civil rights movement in general. And there was some immediate progress in the 60s. And then it began to fade, slow down, and really stop through the 70s. And they began to do research to try to understand why it was slowing down, what was stopping, and what could be done about it. That's the origins of critical race theory. And it's been co-opted by some people on the left who, in my reading, don't fully understand what they're talking about, one. And two, really unskillfully try to apply it in their places of work and in their schools. So again, just for anybody who might be listening, I didn't say that anyone who's trying to make history accurate in a school district is misapplying critical race theory. I'm saying there are some people who are, and they make it very easy for the right to just take the phrase critical race theory and make it into a bad thing, which if you understand it, it's not. It's working towards that true equality that was first promised founding documents in the Constitution and the amendments, and then further promised in 64 and 65, and which we have yet to really fully manifest. So it's a real kind of political mudslinging thing, often by well-intentioned people, sometimes by people who I don't think are well-intentioned. And the scariest thing for me is that enough Americans are willing to get on board either with the unskillful manifestations of critical race theory, and there are those, or get on board with the people who just want to attack critical race theory as though it's, a horrible thing, and it's really not. It's critical, meaning it involves critical thinking and analysis. It has to do with race, but it goes beyond that now. It has to do with gender and orientation as well. And it's a theory, meaning researched, it's written about, and it's tested. And why anybody would be scared of that, which is basically that's how science works, is frightening to me. But many Americans have bought onto both sides of that argument. And I would argue that very few of them actually know what they're arguing about.
Well, see, that's what I wanted to say is, that's what I think that Trump does not get credit for, that I think he's done brilliantly. He's tapped into the fact that most Americans don't read deeply enough about issues to really, and this is my opinion, to really vote, to be honest. I think that, we should change how voting does. But I know I want to get a lot of pushback from people. I know it's a right to be an American to vote. But to me, if you don't really know what the issues you're voting for, you don't know the candidate's platform, you really shouldn't vote. That's what I mean when I say that. Not to say that anybody should be restricted from voting, but if you're not knowledgeable about what's going on and what this candidate is advocating, you shouldn't vote. But Trump, what he did was he realized that, and that's where I think the Democrats usually get it wrong, is where I'm going with this. And I'm not advocating either for either side. I'm just talking about it from a context of observing and perspective, that Democrats get down on deeper issues and they come up with different language to try to articulate their position. And most people don't read. And from the surface of it, it sounds very confusing and it sounds very antagonizing. And most of the things that the left comes up with, even with terms like Black Lives Matter, and see at the surface, it sounds as though you're saying that only Black Lives Matter. That's what it sounds like on the surface, even though that's not the intent behind the messaging, but that's what it sounds like. And then you can say we're going to defund the police, right? See, those things, critical race theory. See, just those three examples are just statements you can attack within itself because you can apply so much to them because they don't really articulate the statements of what it's really meant behind that. Of course, Black Lives Matter is saying that all lives matter, but the emphasis should be on Black folks stop getting killed and racially profiled by the police. We need to change. But see, that's why I go back to what I think the leadership does wrong is they focus on individuals and calling out individual people when it's a system.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is just a condition of a greater system. So no matter what we do to Trump, it's not going to change the system. And that's where, some people get caught up, well, he needs to go to jail. Well, to be honest, yeah, for the crimes he's committed, absolutely. To show that, American law is right. Because right now, to me, the magnifying glass, the microscope, so to speak, is on Trump in the context that, and that's where I want to say this too as well, that what Trump is really, all this other talk about white supremacy and white privilege to me is just another example of what I mean by people just throwing bad terminology, not really understanding what is said behind those words. When you really want to talk about white supremacy and white privilege, then you hold up the mirror of Trump or the image of Trump. That's what he represents to the fullest extent. Because everybody knows that if it was a white woman, to be an example, that had done the exact same things that Trump does, she would be in jail by now. It would not be an issue. We all know for sure if it was a Black man that's done those things, he wouldn't even got that far down the road to even do half the things Trump was able to do, or, gay or whoever, anyone else outside of a white man, then that he wouldn't allow that to happen. And what's confusing to everybody is you watch the January 6 hearings and they go through all this process and it's like, we saw what he said. We saw what he did. Why do we have to continue to keep dotting every I and crossing every T? And it's like they have to be so careful and so methodical and to make an ironclad case when it's clear what he's done. And again, I'm not using this to bash Trump. It's just these are the facts. Is where I'm going with this. And so, but because we don't talk about systems, is where I'm going. And my end of my point is this: we get caught up in the rhetoric of fighting within the system, and the systems are designed that if you fight within the system, then you're never going to create a new system because it's like if the game is football and I'm saying, well, I want to play basketball, but I'm still going out there with shoulder pads and a helmet and I'm still running my plays, but I'm still trying to tell Perry every time we get in the huddle, well, no, we shouldn't play football anymore. We should play basketball. But then I still run out for my pass and run my routes. I'm not going to change anything that way. I get to the point where I'm going to walk off the field, sit over here and say, I'm going to play basketball, and whatever consequence happens as a result of me changing or playing this new system, this new game, then I'll deal with that. But I'm no longer going to play in this existing system. So that's the analogy I want to use in that context.
Yeah. There's a lot there. I'm going to say a little bit about Trump, but I want to go to the point of the voting again. The book, before I do any writing in the book, I cite former Supreme Court Justice David Souter. And in an interview he did at the University of New Hampshire Law School in 2012, he effectively predicted what was going to happen in America. And he basically said something, and I'm not going to try to quote it, but he basically said that he's not worried about a foreign country coming to attack us. He's not worried about a major war. Maybe he should have worried about that, but he said basically the primary threat to American democracy is civic ignorance, is what he said. And if Americans don't do something about that as a people, if we don't get informed about how the government works and who we need to talk to if we're not happy about something, that someday, much like what happened in the Roman Empire, somebody's going to come along and say, here's all these problems. I know how to fix them. and only I can fix them. And that's,
Hmm.
and that's literally what Donald Trump said. He said, I'm an outsider. I'm not part of the Washington, the Beltway, and only I can fix this. And enough Americans believed him. That, we there's some kind of preparation for voting, and then the flip side of that argument for me is, Americans take their democracy for granted because we're having this important 2022 election in a couple of weeks, and the estimate is maybe about half of registered voters will vote, which is a major problem in a democracy. And there are certain states that are trying to limit people's access to voting. So that's a whole bigger conversation. But getting back to your mention of Trump, I argue in the book that if you really want to understand American shadow, collective American shadow, he embodies all 9 of those traits by himself. He's not the only person in the country that probably does that, but he does it. He proved as president his ignorance of the Constitution and of any kind of sacred scripture. When he was, he held a Bible above his head,
Upside down.
upside down, which a book he had never read, but he knew nothing about the Constitution or any kind of sacred scripture. Not that knowing sacred scripture should be a requirement to be president, but the Constitution probably should. He's arrogant because he'll just make believe whatever he has to make believe and bully people. So there's the bullying piece. He lives in constant fear of being seen as a loser. And I'm not the journalist or the psychologist, but lots has been written about that. He has a history of violence towards women, not beating them so much as touching them sexually in a way they do not want to be touched. His lifestyle is an example of greed and excess, and he's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that he's untrustworthy. That he'll say whatever he needs to say to get what he wants, and he really doesn't care even about his constituents, about the people who are giving him money and who voted for him. He doesn't. It's about branding himself. So, he's an example of this collective shadow, and unfortunately, from where I'm sitting, it is unfortunate. He's also an example of how we really don't have, and this is what you alluded to, there isn't equal protection of the laws here. Because if you did what he was doing, and even if I did it as a heterosexual, cisgendered, old white guy, you and I would be in jail by now, or whatever. But because he has money and he can afford to pay attorneys, and he has enough people who support him because they see him as important for their own power. These are members of the Senate and the House of Representatives. He gets all of this support. But if it happened to the average person, woman, black or white, gay or straight, we'd be behind bars already. And it's important then that the Justice Department, I believe, as you said, they have to get into the minutia, because if it's going to be a trial and they want a conviction, it's not about what's just or right. It's about the legal process. And if they don't do the legal process right, he can continue to get away with what he's getting away with. But there, if you have a lot of money, you have much better protection of the laws than if you don't have money in this country. And I think he's an exemplar for that.
Well, I mean, that's true. But then I add the but to that. And the but I mean by adding to that is that like Trump is I think it's 5 different suits coming at him right now. You got the Attorney General, you got the January 6th committee, you got the Justice Department looking into the fact he stole classified documents. So you can kind of, no one will even have that many crimes against them at one particular time. And see, I used to have a security clearance. I worked in the security world, and it was clear that if I took out one document and took it home by accident, I never even made the news. I would just disappeared. if they found out that I had that document. They wouldn't have cared about what my rationale was, what my reasoning was. I forgot, I misplaced it, I shouldn't, I want to work it out at home. I was clear on, once I had a clearance, what the rules are.
Yep.
And my point is that alone, take away January 6th, take away, um, all the other crimes Trump is and being looked at for examine or, you know, but that alone right there warrants that immediately. It's like and to your point, that's why I would say any other white male, doesn't matter, they would have been locked up for that reason.
Yep.
For the fact that he's still able to even talk about it and have attorneys even mount a defense, is that to me just shows that the law is not as just as it's claimed to be, and that's where America is really falling apart right now. I think that's really where our country, because now what is showing the rest of other folks who are law abiding is that, wow, all this time I believe that at the end of the day that there were certain things that no one can get away with, and now you're showing me that there's an exception to that rule that he can get. Because see, what's scarier to me is not so much Trump, it's the next version of Trump that comes along that doesn't have the ignorance that Trump has. That is not as willing to, you know, throw himself out there and just say silly words, but that's much more strategic, much more methodical, much more intentional. And that is a person I'm scared of. And that's what's being created from that. Because everybody realized Trump is eventually going to fall, but he's not going to fall until this next person rises. Then his use would no longer be needed. That's how the systems work. Everybody is never based on the individual. The system will use you as an individual until it no longer needs you. And no matter who it is, that eventually it would drop you off. Trump will go to jail and people will think that's justice. But this new person was going to take on all the behavior characteristics of Trump within the same existing system, and it's going to be worse. And we're going to be worse off than we are currently. I know we got to kind of off the topic of the collective shadow, but that to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong as I go down this journey, but I'm looking at the collective shadow as being a part of the system and those being kind of integrally woven together in that context.
Oh yeah. In fact, thank you. And that I mean, in a nutshell, I mean, that's probably, if you had said that to me a year ago, I would have put that sentence in the book. But that is it. I mean, so it's the collective shadow. It's the water we're swimming in. It's the air we're breathing in. It's this system that sometimes that we don't even remember is there because it's just part of how our lives are. That is the collective shadow of the country. And I would say for anybody listening to this is that one way into really beginning, if you want to get serious about it, first as an individual, because you're not going to, no one person get out there and it's going to change the entire system or the country. I'm not going to do it. I wish I could. But, how am I ignorant? What am I asking myself? How am I ignorant? What am I not seeing that I should see? That would be helpful to see. How am I arrogant in my ignorance? I don't know, but I'm still making these points. What am I afraid of? How is fear impacting what I think about? How am I a bigot? And bigotry, again, is just believing that my way is right and then I just destroy or criticize any other view. How do I bully others? How am I violent? And probably I would guess that the vast majority of Americans aren't actually violent. So I think most Americans are really decent people. I really believe that. But how do greed, excess, and untrustworthiness show up in my own life? So doing my own homework first, getting a sense of who I really am and who I really am not, and then how happy am I with what's going on around me, especially, but not only with the government. But that's, I'm trying to say a lot in a little bit of time here. So, but yeah, so what you're saying is absolutely true, King. I mean, look no further than our ignorance, our collective ignorance of this system that kind of, it's the puppeteer. It pulls all the strings, everything from our healthcare to how we use our military to who gets to vote and when to, I mean, you name it. It's all of the strings being pulled. And it's a system, which, as you constantly say, and I really appreciate it, that it's going to be really hard to change. It in many ways needs to be replaced. And even that statement can be taken, so for some people that means, okay, storm the Capitol. And that's how we'll begin to use the system by disrupting, the election. And so we have to be really careful with our language as well, because it's, anything can be co-opted.
Right. You're absolutely right. And
Yeah.
see, when I advocate create new systems, I'm saying that you create smaller systems first. And again, that's the engineering to me who understands how systems work. But like you're saying, someone
Yeah.
else can co-op it. And next thing create new systems mean overthrowing the government. Someone now changes that words, and then that becomes a rally cry. So anytime someone says change, create new systems, they're attacked as you're an American. That can easily be turned into that rallying cry,
Yeah.
because that's what the existing system says. This is how you handle that. So this is why I recommend, just real quick before we wrap up, just give people an example what I mean when I say create new systems. Let's just take, for example, the political system. I'm not saying throw out the entire political system in one session in 1 year. It's not going to happen. What I'm saying, you make small marginal changes to create a new structure, new system. And what I mean by that is the existing system tells us you vote for candidates, particularly for marginalized, oppressed communities that I come from. You
Mm-hmm.
vote for a candidate, because the candidate is speaking all the things that speaking so to speak to your pain. I understand that there's bad schooling. I understand there's crime. I understand that there's food deserts. Now I understand there's homelessness, people not being paid properly. So I'm going to change all that. Knowing that they're not going to change any of that. That's just what they're running on. And we vote for these candidates based on that. And these candidates don't have any impact in our lives. Whereas what I'm advocating is change voting for city council people, or putting a focus on them and focus on voting for folks who really do have an impact, such as the prosecutors and the judges. The two people who just seem to get in office, they're on the ballot. No one talks about them when we go to vote. They're just thrown on there on the ballot, and we vote or don't vote. And those are the folks who have much more of an immediate impact on those marginalized communities, as the judges and the prosecutors. If we focus on voting them out of office and voting more justice focused prosecutors and judges, that would have more immediate impact than electing a local council person who's not going to do anything at all. And see, that's just a small new system we focus on, and still within the existing overall political system, but that change can have major impacts. So I just want to kind of give that as an example of what I'm referring to. And I'm going to start putting out these little examples of what I mean of creating new, smaller systems within the existing system, so that folks don't think I'm advocating overthrow the government, because I'm not. I'm
Yeah.
advocating, let's put our energy behind doing something collective, co-creating a better world that we can begin to function in. And if we have that kind of success there, I believe that would attract more people to what we begin to build. And that's what I'm advocating at the end of the day.
Yeah, a great example. That idea of smaller systems that can really impact the immediate lives of real people, in a fairly quick time frame, as opposed to, as you said, here are the issues impact on a national scale, knowing that I'm not going to be able to do it, but it's important for me to say it so I can get elected. So I love that example. Yeah.
And we've reached the top of our hour, so it's our time for us to go ahead and, share who we believe is a human being, whether it's past or present, who exhibits fully human lifestyle that we're advocating. And real quick, before I go there, I just want to make this statement for our listening audience, for folks who may be new to our show. The Fully Human Connections podcast, again, we're not saying we have the answers, but we're saying we're committed to the conversations that most folks are uncomfortable having. And that's the only way we can really begin to become fully human, is being open to having these discussions, whether we agree or disagree. But it's how we disagree is what makes us fully human. And so I just want to make sure I put that out there, so folks don't think that we're advocating for any political party, any political or agenda. It's just Reggie and I discussing what we feel based off using his book as a model of how we can begin to change American narratives. So, with that being said, I just want to say that my person I want to choose this for this week as a person who exhibited fully human is Rosa Parks. And I'm choosing Rosa Parks because we always heard about Rosa Parks being a person who's selling, who didn't give up her seat on the bus, and that's what she's known throughout history for. But it's a new documentary that's actually going to be uh, coming out tonight on Peacock. It's called the Revolutionary Life of Rosa Parks, which really lays out who she really is and what she's really done at the rest of her life, uh, prior to the bus boycott and then post bus boycott. That's really astonishing, and to know that she only gets a footnote in history as just a person who didn't give up her seat is just really doing her a disjustice. But my reason for choosing her, just real quick, is the fact that, again, I choose people who exhibit fully human because they know they see an injustice, they choose to stand against that injustice, knowing fully well that the system is going to come at them in full brunt, and they're willing to deal with the consequences, whether it means personal injury, financial loss, or death, or just being ostracized.
Yeah, thank you for that, King. And so I'm going to mention someone who was thrown into being fully human in a really difficult way, who was recently in the news in the last week as well. But as somebody who I knew as a high school kid when I was a teacher, actually didn't teach him, but I knew who he was. He knew who I was, and he was one of the parents who lost a son at Sandy Hook school shooting in 2012. And he was recently in the news again, he and his wife, because they were part of the Alex Jones trial, the guy who made millions and millions of dollars saying it was a hoax. So his name is Mark Barden. He was a musician. He still is a musician. And I spoke with him briefly in 2016. And I love to talk to people, and I'm good at difficult conversations. It was probably the hardest one I ever had. Just how do I greet someone who lost his son to that kind of violence? And there's too many people like him in this country who have lost their children. But he took his grief, he and other people, and built a program called Sandy Hook Promise, which has educated over 2 million people across the country now in terms of, what to look for in terms of, young people who might be themselves or others. And they also do some lobbying in Congress. But just the way he has held his grief set, I'm sure there's rage there. And with other children, he has 2 other kids who are still alive, and just managed to remain a husband and a father amid all of that is an unfortunate, but I think admirable example of what it means to be fully human. So that's Mark Barden.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Reggie. Again, thank you for writing a book that helps spur and we set the context for our discussions. And thank you for your investment of time and energy. And listening audience, thank you again. We know we ran over a little bit, but we appreciate those who still hanging with us and watching this later. We definitely appreciate your investment time and energy as well. But until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., we want to wish everyone explore ways to become fully human in your world. Definitely begin to explore those conversations. And we wish everyone a blessed and productive week. Thank you.
Thanks, King.